Hello everybody. When I was growing up, there were few things less cool than a BMW motorbike or a Volvo car. Now though, it seems like nothing could be further from the truth. Now it's very possible to identify the exact moment at which point BMW motorbikes became cool, because it's when somebody at KTM had their own Gerald Ratner moment and told Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman to go elsewhere for their motorbikes for their big trip. Volvo cars, though, are a little bit trickier because I can't really seem to work out when it is exactly that they suddenly became a cool thing. And the really weird thing is it's not just the newer generation of Volvos which have found favour, it's older ones too, and they've become very popular amongst the young petrolhead community. In fact, this car brought to me today is owned by a 20-year-old called Greg, who's a fan of the channel and evidently now a fan of Volvos as well. This is his second, and it follows a very similar looking V40 T5, also in the Rebel Blue, known to many as Polestar Blue. Until he emailed me, I didn't realise they'd actually made a hot version of the V40 with the fabled 2.5 litre 5-cylinder engine that many people will know as the Ford Focus ST or RS lump. The truth is it was in fact a Volvo engine that Ford pinched because they owned Volvo at the time, and you can do that sort of thing when you own another manufacturer. This was more or less the final swan song of the 5-cylinder, certainly in a compact car, and it existed only for about a year or so of the V40's production run. I was well aware that the C30 had the T5 as an option, but I had no idea they ever put it in this. The reasoning for that is fairly simple. It was replaced pretty early on in the production run with the 2-litre 4-cylinder turbo that was then used in most of the rest of the Volvo lineup. As a result, only 17 of these ever made it to the UK. By his own admission, Greg doesn't really drive this car too enthusiastically much of the time. That may be part of the reason he's managed to achieve a 31 mpg average over the last 4,000 miles. But it was still the engine which really drew him to this particular car. After all, it looks near enough the same as the T2 he used to have. That had a 2-litre 4-cylinder putting out about 120 horsepower, less than half what this makes, which is just over 250. You've also got just over 260 pound-foot of torque, and remarkably, this car is entirely standard. As far as we're aware, nearly all of the other T5 V40s out there have had some modifications of some description, and Greg's currently trying to decide whether to do any mods himself because he'd like to, but also there is a real value to this car being absolutely bone stock. So maybe pop into the comments down below and tell us what you would do. I personally would leave this car pretty much standard. The one thing that I think maybe would be worth doing is putting an exhaust on, because it's reasonably quiet, this thing, and I think it could do with being opened up just a little bit more so you can get that beautiful 5-cylinder signature sound. As we are currently stuck behind a Pallet Plus lorry, now's as good a time as any to talk you through some of the many features this car has. And one of the issues with a Volvo, and I've considered one at some points in the past myself, is that as standard, they don't really give you all that much. To get a really good one, you need to pick a higher trim level, and even then there'll be some option packs you probably want as well. The V40 T5 came only in 2 flavours. There was the slightly larger, more rugged off-road looking Cross Country, which apparently was the more popular of the two, or this one, the sort of hatchback, which came in R-Design Lux Nav spec. As a result, you got quite a bit of stuff as standard, on top of which this car then had a few option boxes ticked too, perhaps because it once belonged to Volvo themselves. So there's an awful lot in here. In no particular order, we have heated seats, we have full leather, and the seats themselves, by the way, are really quite magnificent. Very typical Volvo thing. They aren't very heavily bolstered, so they're not the best at holding you in when you're going around a bend, but they are extraordinarily comfortable, and the leather is of a very nice quality too, and they're pretty stylish. In fact, the whole interior I think still looks pretty damn good. You've got heated front screen, classic Ford thing, you've got steering wheel controls, you've got aircon of course, you've got Bluetooth, you've got sat-nav, front and rear parking sensors. In fact, the car can even park itself, but weirdly you don't have a reversing camera. You have a panoramic roof, you have a stereo that's actually not too bad, and I'm sure there's plenty of other stuff I've missed off the list as well. This being a Volvo, of course, there's plenty of safety kit as standard, airbags everywhere you look, and this one's also got Bliss, which is their lane departure warning alert thing. That, I believe, was an option. Sadly, there was no manual option for the T5. You could only have this 6-speed Geartronic setup. And to be honest, around town and driving sedately actually works really quite well. I love the sort of glassy, part illuminated design of the gear lever. It's actually a nice thing, although, as with many cars, I'm upset that they've got the up and down the wrong way round. There are no paddles on the steering wheel, so if you want to change gear yourself, you're going to have to do it down here. This centre console is also laid out in very much the same way you'd find in nearly all Volvos of the period, and you'll find only the odd bit of Ford poking through here and there, like the fact that the bonnet release is over on that side, the fact that window switches are the classic Ford setup that you see in, well, nearly every single Ford-related car made for about 20 years or so. Even the current V60 is actually still using these, despite no longer being a Ford thing. Because the Ford connection is quite strong, people always try and draw comparisons with an equivalent Ford product, and if you had to try and find one, I would say the closest you'll get is the second generation Focus ST, which also has the 5-cylinder Volvo-derived engine, probably a similar amount of power from memory, but is a very, very different looking thing, and I would say has not aged anywhere near as well as this inside or out. I think the V40 is actually a pretty good looking car. Technically speaking, this actually superseded a number of different models. You had the C30, the S40 and the V50. But oddly, it's not actually a real direct replacement for any of those. The C30 was a noticeably smaller, very cool looking 2-door hatch. I'm sure you know the thing that I'm talking about, and I've always had a bit of a curiosity towards them, but unfortunately they're just not quite big enough for me to have ever bought one because I would need something a little bit more practical. Then the S40 is a saloon, and this is a hatchback, so it's not really a direct equivalent, and the V50 was an estate, whereas this is, I guess, maybe the closest in spirit to that, but it's not actually that big. Considering Volvo's sort of proud heritage of being the antiques load lugger of choice, it's not exactly the most spacious. In fact, even rear seat room is not excellent. If you are a young petrolhead, you probably won't care, because when you're young, you will happily suffer to have a nice fun car. But as you get a little bit older, you may find that Aunt Beryl isn't too happy about being stuffed in the rear. So that's a little bit of the sensible. Now, how does it perform when you're trying to have fun? The car's actually really quite capable. It's not exactly an exciting thing to try and throw into a bend. The steering doesn't come alive with the same sort of excitement and fizz you'd find in, say, a Fiesta ST or the smaller hatchbacks like that, but it's a very competent and rather mature thing. Grip levels in the corner are pretty decent. This car's just had a change of tyres from some Goodyear Eagle F1 Asymmetrics to Michelin Pilot Sports. Apparently, that's made quite a big difference, and grip levels are now much better than they once were. There is no limited slip diff in this, although I have to be honest, in normal driving conditions on the road, it's not something you ever tend to feel the absence of. I've no doubt that there's somebody out there who'll happily fit one to your car, but I don't think it's really particularly necessary. The gearbox, sadly, is a little bit of a letdown for sporty driving because it's not very responsive nor particularly quick to change. Really, it's best just to leave it in its sports mode if you do want to have some fun, which you can access very easily by just simply moving the lever over. Beyond the gear mode, there isn't really much to change in this car if you want a more dynamic driving experience. If you pop into the menu, you'll eventually be able to disable one level of the traction control, and we've done that, and I have to say that I haven't really noticed traction control intervening at all, but in truth, on a day like today, where it's bone dry and very warm, I'm not sure how much you really would have noticed the traction control intervening anyway, so I'm not really going to render judgment there. There are no adaptive dampers or anything like that to configure, so the car is refreshingly free of driving modes. Now, despite the fact the interior is now a little bit out of date, in many ways actually it doesn't feel too bad. Honestly, the real thing that dates this interior is the small screen up here. It's actually quite clear, fairly high resolution, and better than some other Volvo units that I've used, but it's lacking a lot of functionality. Of course, no Android Auto, Apple CarPlay or any of that stuff. However, the dash I actually really like, and that actually could be something in production now. It's very simple, very elegant, but it tells you absolutely everything you need to know. And honestly, a lot of the modern virtual dashes that I've used don't really give you any more than this one does, but at least this feels kind of special. and overall it does feel like a real step up over your equivalent Ford. Rear passengers, I'm sure, will be grateful for the panoramic roof. It doesn't open, and honestly up front you don't really even notice that it's there. However, without it, this dark headliner would make the rear seats feel very cramped and claustrophobic indeed. Given the rare nature of this car, you would have thought that it would command a fairly serious premium, but the truth is, they're not actually that bad. And prices are all over the shop for all cars at the moment, and because these are such a rare thing, it's actually very difficult to even find one for sale, let alone a selection to get a good feel for prices. However, if I were to say about £10,000, that should give you a rough idea of the kind of money that you're looking at. I am now following a Rover 200, which appears to have a full complement of old people in it. I cannot recall the last time I was stuck behind one of those. It's been a good few years, I can tell you. So as it's going to take a few minutes before we can safely pass the Old Biddy Express, I'd once again ask you to jump into the comments section if you are a person that's into your Volvos, particularly if you're a younger person into your Volvos. I'd really love to know why that is. What drew you to the brand? What got you into it? And for Greg, I think it was more of a sort of happy accident. He bought his first car because it kind of, filled his needs, and then he just wound up really getting into it and kind of falling for it. His enthusiasm for the brand is so great that he's now one of the admins for the Volvo Surrey, Sussex and Hampshire Facebook group. So if you happen to be in Surrey, Sussex or Hampshire, or very close to, and you either have a Volvo or are lusting for one, I'm sure he and the others there would appreciate you stopping by and saying hello and introducing yourself. One thing you also notice with this car is that you do feel like you're quite high up. Now, I'm not sure how much that is a placebo effect, because I've been doing a lot of miles in the 430 recently, and in that, you are sat on the floor, so that could just be me getting fooled into thinking it's a bit tall, but I am definitely higher than Beryl down there, that's for sure. I must say that overall, I've actually been quite impressed with the ride comfort. Now, Greg thinks this car is fairly stiff, and it probably is compared to his old T2. But when you spend as much time as I do in some of the more modern, sporty stuff, which seems to think that having a stiff suspension is the only way to go, this actually is quite refreshing. Very nice, very compliant. Even at lower speeds, it's actually not that bad. You can tell there's just a little edge of firmness to the suspension, but even over the odd manhole cover, this is never jarring at all. These seats certainly help quite a bit. I've got to say, it's a really nice thing to spend some time in. You could happily do quite a few miles in this. As it happens, Greg doesn't need to do too many miles in his car these days, and that's one of the reasons that he upgraded to the 5-cylinder. This was the only engine that he wanted. The 4-cylinder didn't really appeal to him that much at all. When pressing on, you need to be a little wary of the front washing wide, because you've got that big 5-cylinder engine mounted transversely up front. That is, of course, where most of the weight sits. So you just need to be aware that the car isn't going to hold onto a corner as much as you might hope. Certainly compared to, say, a modern Golf R or something like that, it does struggle a little bit for grip. But to be honest, by the time that becomes an issue, you're already going plenty quick. So for most people, I'd say it's not something to worry about. Brakes actually quite nice. Do require a little bit more pedal travel than you may expect. Car rolls just a little bit, but body control is generally pretty good. The engine delivers fairly smooth, linear power, and with the gearbox in auto mode, it seems pretty difficult to try and catch it out and get it off boost. However, what you are missing here is that huge, big turbocharged hit at 3,000 RPM that I've got from some of the, say, modified cars that run this engine. But you're also then missing the crazy amounts of torque steer that some of those cars also suffer. So I suppose on that front, you win some and you lose some. Visibility is reasonable. The biggest problem is this A-pillar, which is fairly chunky and sits at an angle that's fairly extreme. And that means I could see quite a few scenarios where you'd be approaching a roundabout, something like that, and it'd be very easy to lose a whole car here. I can get entirely why people would want to modify one of these, and I'm sure you could actually do some pretty cool things with it, because you'd have essentially a slightly cooler Focus ST. But I think to do that would really be to take away from some of the character of the car. If you made this low and stiff and loud and all that stuff, yeah, okay, maybe some people would think it is cool, but to me, it just wouldn't be right. The lack of a reversing camera is a very odd thing. I do like the fact this car still has an old-fashioned gear lever, so there's never any doubt whether you're in drive, reverse, neutral, park, or sport. And to be fair, left in auto mode, even in drive, the gearbox actually is fairly reasonable. You can get up to speed, no trouble at all. Every now and again, it seems to change down a gear when it maybe didn't really need to, but honestly, it's not much of a problem. So if you are a young person on the hunt for something dailyable but interesting, for your £10,000 you could probably get something with quite a bit more space in it. You could get something a little bit faster, and you probably could get something with a slightly more exciting engine too. But this does a fairly good job of giving you just a little bit of everything, and in a package which is just that little bit unusual. And I always do like the unusual. There is not a JayEmm equivalent of the Doug score, but if there were, I'd say this is a real sort of 7.5 out of 10 car. It's far from bad. I don't think it's one of the all-time greats, but for the right person, it's definitely the right car. And I'm very glad to have experienced it. So, as ever, it's a big thanks to Greg for bringing his car out. Thanks to you for watching. Please like, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already.